Welcome back to the ChessGoals YouTube channel. In today's video, we're going to analyze a game from VIP member Bob G. If you're interested in joining ChessGoals, check out the links in the description below. So in this game, Bob is playing the white pieces, and we see him start with 1d4. And after knight f6, knight c3, we get this interesting line with bishop out to g5, attacking the knight on f6 immediately. And black is sort of playing a King's Indian defense type setup. When you see this dark bishop go to g7, the light bishop can come out this way. And I really like what Bob did here. He plays queen d2, preparing this bishop to h6 idea, and Bob wants to queenside castle next. So this is going to be a kingside attack, and this matches our plans from the classical 1d4 repertoire, but also a bit in our e4 repertoire as well. So I really enjoy these kingside attacks with a queenside castle for white. And here Bob's opponent plays pawn to h6, putting the question to the bishop. Bob retreats it to e3, which threatens long-term to take on h6. So it's very difficult for black to get castled here because of bishop takes h6 for white. So here black plays knight g4, putting the question to the bishop. I think at this point, white should play bishop to f4. Preserve this bishop because it's a strong attacking piece. So for example, let's say e5 is played. Takes, bishop back to g3. Now black has this bad pawn on e5 that blocks the bishop on g7, and white's going to queenside castle, and there's a lot of pressure on the e5 pawn, whereas the e4 pawn is pretty safe, defended by the c3 knight. I really like this position for white. In the game, queenside castle was played, and I think this is also good for white. But the next move, I believe there's a nice improvement. After knight takes e3, white played f takes e. And I think this is the first big critical moment of the game. Queen takes e3 is the stronger move. And here's the reason why. After f takes e3, there's this chance for these two pawns to be blockaded. And if black decides to play e5 straight away, all of a sudden you notice that these pawns are blocked and there's no way for white to fix the pawns. This is a long-term positional weakness. So if you're going to accept that long-term weakness as white, you would like to be able to get something in return. So let's say, for example, d takes e was played. If black had to take with the d pawn, maybe you could get a little bit of play back because you have bishop to c4 ideas, you control the d file, the c4 bishop hits f7. But the problem is black can take with the knight. And this is very solid for black, and these pawns are both still weak. So if we go back to the game line, f takes e3, castle for black. Here Bob played pawn to g4. And I really like this idea, and it partially because e5 is kind of a mistake for black now. E5 could also be played for white, and I actually like this move a lot as well, because after d takes e, even though this looks strange, why should white give up the pawn? Pawn to e6 is threatened. And if black plays e6 to block the pawn, now there's knight to e4. And look at this. The d7 knight is pinned to the queen, and this knight on e4 is a monster. It's a dynamic position for white, and black has to be very careful here. So after g4, black plays pawn to e5. We see h4 by Bob, c6 by black. And I really like how Bob is playing this aggressively. Even though Stockfish may not agree with every move, I think in a position like this where it tends to be pretty tactical, we don't want to put too much weight into those differences with Stockfish. Like really we want to get an overall picture of the game, and I believe Bob played this next segment very nicely. Bishop to c4. Even though Stockfish says it's a mistake due to b5, I think the style of this move is correct. White wants to play aggressively and attack the black king, so I really like that. Knight b6, bishop drops back. Still gets to stay on this nice diagonal. Bishop takes g4. So black grabs the first pawn. And at this point, Bob has to be thinking, okay, I'm down a pawn, but how do I get counterplay? And I'm guessing that he gave up this pawn knowing that he could get an attack. And I think that's a great decision. Queen g2 was played. And after bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, black played a very natural move, pawn to h5, not wanting the white h-pawn to go up to h5, but this is actually a big mistake. So if we look at the practical nature of the last three moves for white, bishop to c4, bringing it back to b3, getting the g-pawn up even prior to that. I think it's a really good way for white to play for an advantage, and I like what you did here, Bob. So now rook to g1 was played. You could potentially play the h rook to the g1 square, but I don't think that's a big deal. White is down a pawn, but really there's good compensation for that pawn at this point. Now here black plays king to h7, and this is a mistake. I think the reason why it was played though is because this position is so difficult to play for black. We look at the pin on the pawn on f7, rook takes g6 ideas. Black is having trouble figuring out how do I get out of this mess, and that's why black ended up moving the king. And this is something that I talk about all the time. If a position is uncomfortable, that's when mistakes tend to occur. So what Bob did in this game was he took a position that was a little bit worse with these bad e-pawns. He played very actively with bishop to c4, pawn to g4, pawn to h4, used all of that activity to put tough questions to the opponent. That's when his opponent started to make some mistakes. This is not a lucky win. This is good play by Bob, and the opponent eventually made some mistakes. I really like what you did here, Bob. King to h7 was played, and here Bob finds bishop takes f7, and now the g-pawn is also attacked. This is a very strong position for white. Rook takes f7 was played, so black gives up the exchange, bails out, and plays queen to f6, offering the queen trade. I think it's okay to avoid the queen trade here, but rook to f1 is probably the strongest move. And here's why. Right now we are up 2 points of material. What's the best chance for black to come back in this position? Black needs to do exactly what white did in the last 10 moves, the last 7 or 8 moves. Black needs to play aggressively. Black needs to create some counter chances. The way that's going to happen is if black can use a combination of this knight, queen, and bishop to get at the white king. It doesn't look like it's going to happen soon in this position, but what's going to happen is the center pawns will trade. These 2 pawns are going to trade off, and that opens up this long diagonal. And once black gets that long diagonal open, if the queens are on the board, black starts to get counterplay. So what white can do here is white can trade queens, but an even stronger version of that is to play rook f1. And this encourages black to be the one to make the queen trade, because if black doesn't take here, there's really no other good moves. Playing back here allows rook h to g1. Now we see this pawn attack twice. This is a really bad position for black, and probably black is forced to queen trade now at this point. And here white doesn't even have to take. Now white could take this pawn, maybe bring this rook into f7. Very nice position. So I think a queen trade is a nice idea for white, and if you can make it an even more favorable situation where a rook ends up on f7 after the queen trade, that win's going to be a lot smoother. Queen takes b7 was played, e takes d4, e takes d4, queen takes d4. Now we're starting to see this compensation for black. Look at all the squares I highlighted, the long diagonal, knight to c4. This is something that I've talked with Bob about, and he's working on in terms of one of his overall takeaways, is risk management. I love to talk risk reward in chess positions. I love to talk odds of winning, chances of blundering, and especially with Bob. Bob knows risk well, he knows risk reward. This is a position where you want to try to make it very calm and convert the position without a lot of risk for white. So at this point, white actually wants a queen trade. I think queen to f7 is the strongest move here, creating this double attack on g6, and really the only way out for black is to bring the queen back and offer the queen trade again. So let's say queen to f6, and now we can repeat this idea, rook to f1, limiting the scope of black's counterplay. I think this is the smoothest way to convert the win. In the game, rook to d1 was played, and black had queen to e3 check here, followed by knight to c4. Already, I think this position is very tough for white to play. And I think if you look at the Stockfish eval, white might have a small advantage at this point. But in terms of practical play, it's getting very dicey. And look at this example line. What if white grabs the free rook? We can see Stockfish is calling this a mistake. There is knight to a3 check. What a tactic. And if the king sidesteps to a1, now there's queen takes c3. And this is going to be a draw with best play. For example, queen b7 to guard this b2 pawn so there's no checkmate. Knight takes c2 and black can repeat. This is a repetition for a draw. So after rook to d1, queen to e3 check was already giving black really good play here. Queen c5 was played. Rook f1, rook g8, rook f7, that's a good move. Knight to c4. But now we see these pieces coming alive for black. Queen, knight, bishop, they're all kind of pointing at these dark squares, right? That's what white has to be careful about. That's where the counterplay is coming from. Queen takes a7 was played. Good move, threatening the queen trade. Queen e5. Now here, rook d to f1 was played. I think this is the last chance to really try to force this queen trade. Queen to d4. I like this move a lot. Offers the queen trade, lines the queen up with g7, lines the queen up with c4. I don't think there's really any way out of the queen trade for black. If a move like queen to e6 was played, the problem is now black's sort of in this zugzwang position where there's not a lot of great moves. This rook can slide across the 7th rank to safety. And if the king moves away, queen could even come down to the 7th rank potentially. But I think this is really kind of limiting the counterplay, or at least it's attempting to limit the counterplay with the queen trade offer. So after rook d to f1, knight takes b2 was found by black. Very strong move. This is blowing open the position of the white king. We can see things are exposed over here on the dark squares. Queen to a3, and now black is already better. Knight to c4, queen b3, d5, queen e3 check, and knight to d2 with the fork. And the reason I'm not trying to put too much weight onto these last moves is I think for Bob, I've seen a lot of his games, I think it's more important to focus on converting that win than the blunders at the very end when the clocks are getting low. So Bob mentions his takeaways in the notes. And this is something that I want all of you guys to do with your own games when you analyze them, is log your takeaways. Try to think of things that you can improve in future games. That'll be very useful. And if you have a spreadsheet or a notebook where you handwrite down the takeaways, even better, right? You want to track these takeaways over time and find consistent things in your play that you can work on and actively think about in all the future games. So Bob mentions that time management is something he needs to work on. And he says playing more blitz will help that. I agree. And this is something I talked about in the top chess books for non-chess players. Top non-chess books for chess players. System 1 and 2, right? System 1, intuitive. System 2, calculation. We want to build our intuition. We want our mind to be able to think of good moves quickly. That helps a lot with time management. So playing blitz can help train that. The second thing Bob talks about is his risk radar. I think that's true. But in terms of the risk radar, I also think of that in terms of odds and risk reward, right? So not just saying, did I watch my opponent's threats? Did I create a situation where my opponent has less threats, number one, and threats that aren't as strong, number two, right? So that's also part of risk, not just looking for the opponent's moves, but giving them positions where they don't have a lot of tricky moves to come back at us. That's a nice way to simplify and convert winning positions. Number three, Bob said he was playing moves that he wanted to do for the attack, but not necessarily moves to play the position, and should have changed the game approach after being the exchange up. Yes, I agree with that. Go into the conversion mindset, go into the mindset of what are the odds of my opponent coming back, and how do I decrease their odds of coming back. All right, I hope you guys enjoyed this game review from VIP member Bob. Bob, I really enjoyed this game, and we have another really good game of Bob coming up in a few videos where he beats a 2100. That's a very impressive game, Bob. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please like and subscribe. Let me know in the comments what you thought of this game, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.